Thank you, Arlene. Everyone hear us okay? How's that? Mention the Civil War, and most of us think of the land battles at Shiloh, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg. But there was another theater of that war, and it was played out on the water and sometimes far offshore. Tonight, Jerry and I are going to tell you about the navies of the North and the South and the challenges each one faced. Naval technologies were changing at the time. A captain of the 1600s might have felt at home aboard a sailing ship of 1830, but not so by 1860. So a lot of things were changing, not only with propulsion, but this war on the water ushered in a whole new era of warfare with the use of the rifle cannon, underwater mines, torpedoes, called torpedoes, and submarines. The Civil War of the 1860s was much different than our Revolutionary War fought 85 years earlier. The roads were much improved, the railroads were expanding, but in spite of this, the oceans and the rivers carried most of the traffic, and the side that controlled the waterways would win the war.
By April 1861, the 7 states that had seceded from the Union had formed the new government of the Confederate States of America. Southern forces had fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War had formally begun. At this point, President Lincoln had several issues to resolve, some of which involved international maritime law. He and his advisors had decided that the quickest way to win the war was to choke the Confederate economy by blockading all of their water ports. This was characterized as the Anaconda Plan, to block all Confederate water ports in the Atlantic, the Gulf, and on all navigable rivers. President Lincoln announced this plan in a presidential proclamation. And in this document, he intentionally referred to the plan as a blockade, because under maritime law, a blockade was a recognized strategy of war. This would allow the Union Navy to stop, search, and seize any suspected vessel. Now, ironically, when he invoked this law, he de facto recognized the Confederacy as an independent nation and gave any other nation on earth the right to do the same. Lincoln wondered, for example, what the Europeans would do. What would Britain and France do? Would Britain and or France come to the aid of the Confederacy economically, or even go so far as to give it diplomatic status? No doubt, these questions gave President Lincoln sleepless nights.
Southerners saw cotton as their great leverage in the war effort. And this is because thousands of workers in England and France were employed in the textile industry. And for generations, their cotton had come from the southern plantations. So this concept of King Cotton led the Confederacy to believe that England or France, maybe both, would have to intervene in the Civil War and come in on the side of the South just to save their own economies. And since England was the strongest of the nations, it was widely believed that what they did, the others would follow. But there were a number of reasons for the British not to become involved in our Civil War. Their economy was strong enough to absorb any loss of cotton. It said that the warehouses over there were filled with cotton. And other countries were now growing cotton, Argentina and India and Egypt. If that weren't enough, England imported 40% of its grain from the northern states. And besides, the British were building their empire. They didn't want to become involved in our war. So for these reasons alone, the British were not coming. There was another reason. You might recall from your reading of history that early in the war, President Lincoln said this conflict was about preserving the Union. What did they care about preserving our Union over there in England or Europe? They weren't concerned with that. So, I need to take a look at this. Yeah. The merchants and the manufacturers over there were looking for the opportunity to sell their industrial supplies and their goods to the non-industrialized South. But here's that other reason. When President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it changed the purpose of the war from Union preservation to that of human freedom. And what country would fight another that was trying to end slavery? So the Emancipation Proclamation drove the final nail in any hope the Confederacy had for European military intervention. But as we'll see, it didn't stop the sale of arms. Now, as the southern states seceded, they captured any vessels that were trapped in their harbors. A few guns were put aboard them, and from this, a Confederate Navy was born. But it was hardly enough to put more guns on the water. Confederate President Jefferson Davis turned to privateering. Now, a privateer, as the name implies, is a privately owned armed vessel operating by the authority of a government. Well, when Abraham Lincoln heard of these privateers, he issued a warning. He said when captured, they would be hung like pirates. Jefferson Davis responded by saying, for every privateer hung, a Union officer held in captivity would be executed. Well, this eye for an eye policy worked. No privateers were hung. In fact, they were moved from the civilian jails to the military compounds, where they were then treated as prisoners of war.
The Anaconda Plan was to be a joint effort between the Union Army and the Union Navy. Consequently, the Blockade Strategy Board was formed to make plans to seize southern ports or Union bases of operation. Well, now, this was no easy project. With 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline and 180 possible ports to patrol. And in addition, according to international maritime law, this could not be a blockade in name only. It had to be effective. So the first hurdle the Union had to overcome to make the blockade effective was to acquire more ships. At this time, the Union Navy had 42 ships. And most of those were patrolling all over the world. So the government went on an intensive shipbuilding program. And they went on a crash program to acquire any other kind of vessels that they could possibly get their hands on. They armed passenger ships, merchant ships, and even ferry boats for blockade duty. But by 1861, the end of 1861, the fleet had grown to 160 vessels, most of which were now steam-powered. In fact, the nature of the fleet changed drastically. They began to build ships of widely differing character, according to how they were going to be used. For example, most of, or many of, the Union Navy's missions were close into shore in tidal inlets or up on rivers. And they needed vessels that could maneuver quickly and efficiently under those circumstances. And this shipbuilding program was beginning to incorporate new maritime wartime technology. For example, in armament, originally they just used heavier wooden planking to protect their ships. Then they had to graduate to iron plating. And during the program, they found that they needed fewer guns on the ships because the ones they were installing were bigger and had longer range. And mounting systems were evolving also, such as rotating turrets. Now, the second hurdle that they had to overcome was manpower, crews for all of these new ships that they were building. Well, that was no problem at all because 50,000 men volunteered for the service. The third hurdle they had to overcome was strategy. Now, in addition to maintaining the blockade, the Navy had to carry the war into all Confederate territory that could be reached by water. So most of this effort was in support of the Army. And this begged the question of who was in charge on these joint missions. Would it be the senior Navy officer or the senior Army officer? Well, this was partially resolved by creating a new set of Navy officer ranks that exactly matched the Army ranks. Therefore, who was in charge of any particular joint mission depended on the nature and purpose of the mission.
Blockade running is thought of as the most daring and dashing aspect of the Civil War. And there was a patriotic motivation to running the blockade, but there was also a lot of money to be made sneaking European armaments and medical supplies into the southern ports. And much to the chagrin of the southern generals, they also smuggled in much of the more profitable non-military items. Many, 40 or more of the blockade runners were built in Liverpool, and an equal number in France. Many were of British registry, and they were almost all under the command of British naval officers on half pay. As we see from our slide here, a blockade runner could get rich if he was successful. Some of them ran the blockade many times and became very wealthy men in the process. Now, a month after the war began, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation of neutrality, recognizing the Confederate States as belligerents. This upset the North, but not as an independent nation. This upset the South. The Union's, the Confederacy's early battlefield victories over the Union were well covered in the European presses, and it caused some to wonder if the North was up for the fight. But the Union had yet to fully mobilize and bring its industrial might to bear. Now, the blockade was strangling the South, and to break it, the Confederacy would need ironclad vessels. But their industrial plant was weak. They had raw material available in the mines in Virginia and Tennessee and Alabama. Their infrastructure was poor, and so getting the ore from the mines to the furnaces was a real challenge. And the South only had a few foundries and not enough skilled workers, and they needed guns, and they needed boilers and engines and shafts and screws, not to mention powder, shot, and shell. This slide shows us what the South was up against. Just one foundry in the North could turn out 25 of these big guns in a week. Took the South 3 months to build one. The Confederacy could not hope to match the industrial might of the North when it came to turning out guns and warships. For this, they needed help from Europe. Confederate agents were in England and France negotiating with shipyards over there to build raiders and ironclads. By 1862, a year and a half after the war began, 2 of these raiders were completed in Liverpool. And one of them, the Alabama, was already out on the high seas capturing and destroying Yankee shipping and sending insurance rates through the roof. Now, we almost went to war with England twice during our Civil War. The first time was over the Trent affair, and this happened fairly early in the war, when a U.S. warship stopped a British packet ship, passenger ship, called the Trent, and removed 2 Confederate agents that were on their way to Europe. When the British got wind of this, they were outraged over this flagrant violation of their flag on the high seas. They demanded an immediate apology, the release of the agents, and to make their point, they sent 11,000 armed troops to Canada, and they threatened to close the British legation. Now, never mind that the British had done much the same to us leading up to the War of 1812. But President Lincoln didn't want a war, and neither did Queen Victoria. So apologies were made, the proper ministers and secretaries shook hands, and soon the agents were released and on another ship bound for England.
In the initial phase of the blockade, the Union concentrated most of its effort on the Atlantic coast because most of the blockade runners came from neutral ports in Bermuda and the Bahamas. So you can see from this map here the Union's logic in concentrating most of their effort around South Carolina. And it needed a string of bases in that area for one particular reason. Most of the fleet was now steam-powered. Now you can provision a sailing ship for months at sea, but a steamer has to return to port more often for fuel and for maintenance. So the capture of Port Royal, South Carolina, provided the Navy with a much-needed maintenance and supply facility. Unfortunately, it also became an early base for the expansion of the blockade. Ha ha. Truth be known, the early blockade was a laughing stock because the runners just seemed to come and go whenever they pleased. And the northern newspapers were relentless in their criticism of the Navy, as you can see from this political cartoon. But fortunately, the fleet slowly began to grow to the point to where the North could plug some of the holes in the blockade. And this is one of its first efforts. Hatteras Inlet, North Carolina. Many of the Confederate privateers that Jim spoke of operated out of this area, as well as blockade runners. And it was guarded by Fort Hatteras and Fort Clark. And the Union collected a large fleet to try to close this port. And they did it in a very innovative way. They had the fleet sail in a continuous circle to provide a moving target, all the while pounding the ports with their guns. And it worked. And this was a new innovation in maritime warfare. It was made possible only by the use of steam-powered vessels. So, Hatteras Inlet was closed to the privateers and the blockade runners. About 6 months later, the Union Navy began taking delivery of something called 90-day gunboats. This referred to the time it took to build one. And these were just marvelously versatile little vessels. They were both steam and sail powered. They had a draft of less than 10 feet and a top speed of 10 knots, so they could operate anywhere, in tidal inlets, up rivers, as well as out in the open ocean. And I'd like to show you a couple of examples of things that one of these little 90-day gunboats did. USS Ottawa. believe it or not, was credited with capturing a train. No kidding. It happened in Fernandina, Florida. Ottawa was sailing up the river. The railroad tracks paralleled the river for about a mile or so, which allowed Ottawa to sail along and attack the train. Okay? But she also made another notable discovery. She sailed up the St. Johns River from Jacksonville and discovered the famous yacht America. Now this was the ship that gave its name to the America's Cup yacht racing prize. The Confederates had scuttled her when they abandoned Jacksonville. The Navy raised her, repaired her, put 3 guns on her, and guess what? Put her on blockade duty. So, by the spring of 1862, the Navy had recaptured the major ports of Norfolk, Jacksonville, Apalachicola, Pensacola, and Biloxi, Mississippi. So the Anaconda was beginning to tighten its grip.
It's historically true that in time of war, a weaker nation will employ guerrilla tactics and invent new weapons. Well, the Confederate Navy was a miracle of improvisation. It not only built the first torpedo boat, but they also pioneered the underwater electric mine called the torpedo, and they built the first underwater craft that sank a warship. CSS Hundley was a submarine. It was built in a Mobile, Alabama machine shop from a 40-foot long cylindrical iron boiler. It was powered by men turning cranks to operate a propeller. The Hundley was transported on a railroad car up to Charleston Harbor, where on a cold night, the crew cranked their way out 5 miles or more beyond the harbor, where the Union had set up their blockading fleet. And then using its spar, as you see there in the top, it stuck a keg of explosive into the side of the wooden Union warship Housatonic, and then it backed off before it exploded, blew a hole in its side, and sunk the ship. Now, unfortunately for the 8 members of the Hundley crew, they lost their way going back, and they weren't seen again. That is, not until 2000, when the Hundley was raised from the mud, and it's now on display in Charleston. Now, finding men to man their makeshift fleet was a challenge for the Confederacy throughout the war. Because of its strong attachment to the land, the South had only a small maritime population when compared to the North. Now, many of the officers in the old U.S. Navy were Southerners, but the crew came from the North. So for the Confederacy, finding naval officers was much easier than finding a crew. Most of those who served aboard Confederate ocean-going vessels were of mixed nationalities. There were a lot of Englishmen, Irishmen, Scots, there were Dutch, Spanish, and islanders. Early in the war, the Union had to abandon its large naval yard at Norfolk to the advancing Confederates. And before they left, they tried to destroy all of the ships that were then under repair so they wouldn't fall into Confederate hands. And one of them was the large steam frigate Merrimack. But the Confederates refloated it, and they covered it with 4 inches of flattened railroad iron plate, and they rechristened it the Virginia. It was the strangest thing anyone had ever seen. But against Union wooden sailing, Union wooden ships, it was devastating. Now, all that iron made the Virginia very slow and heavy. Nonetheless, March of 1862, the Virginia very slowly made its way down the Elizabeth River and out into Hampton Roads to break through the blockading fleet. Well, when the blockading ships and the shore batteries saw the Virginia coming, they opened up with everything they had. but the cannonballs just bounced off its side and ricocheted away. And then, using its guns and its powerful ram, the Virginia sank 2 of the blockading ships. And it was going after a third, but night was coming on, and the tide was starting to fall. So the captain turned the big ironclad around, and he anchored it right there off Sewell's Point. That's about 4 miles away from the blockading fleet. He had plans to return in the morning and finish the job. He was in for a surprise.
Indeed he was, because USS Monitor had arrived the night before. Now talk about ships the likes of which nobody had ever seen before. The next morning, the Virginia's crew thought the Monitor was a raft. And as it was headed toward its intended target, the raft began to maneuver, and its gun turret began to turn. So the Virginia rounded up and prepared to engage. She fired the first shot about 8:30 in the morning, and all hell broke loose. These 2 ironclads fought, sometimes almost muzzle to muzzle, for 4 hours to a draw. Neither one could do enough damage to get the other one to surrender. So the Virginia went back up the Elizabeth River to her port, and the Union Navy continued to blockade Hampton Roads. But the impact of this fight between the 2 ironclad vessels was heard all around the world, particularly in Europe, where the British and the French navies took note of what ironclad vessels could do to their wooden-hulled fleets. Meanwhile, the Union Navy was having some success in the upper reaches of the Mississippi, just south of Cairo, Illinois. In 1862, they conquered Forts Henry and Donelson, which effectively cut the Confederate supply lines deep into the interior on both the Cumberland and the Tennessee rivers. Now, obviously, the overall goal of the Union Navy was to completely control the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf. But there were 2 stubborn obstacles. One of them was New Orleans. Now, New Orleans was the largest Confederate port, but it was also the most difficult to blockade because the Mississippi emptied into the Gulf through so many outlets. So the Navy decided that it had to take New Orleans itself. Now, there were very few secrets during the Civil War. So the Confederates had already gotten wind of this Yankee decision. So about 70 miles south of New Orleans, they began to reinforce Fort St. Philip on one side of the river and Fort Jackson on the other side of the river. And just south of that, they stretched a heavy chain across the Mississippi. Well, meanwhile, Admiral David Farragut had been assembling a large Yankee fleet. And included in this fleet was about 20 schooners towing 13-inch mortars, which Farragut was going to use to soften up the forts. And along with the naval fleet was an army of several thousand men to occupy New Orleans if the battle was successful. So at the appointed time, the mortars sailed right up to that chain and opened up on the forts. They fired for 3 days, but the Confederates had done their job well because the battlements held. So Farragut decided to fall back on his plan B, which was to sneak past the forts in the dark of night. So about 2 o'clock in the morning, back up. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the fleet sailed right up to that chain, smashed an opening through it, then moved on toward the forts, and began taking fire, not only from the forts, but from a squadron of Confederate gunboats. And a furious firefight ensued. Remarkably enough, all but one of the Union ships made it through, and all but one of the Confederate ships was destroyed. Now the forts, they had been cut off from their supply lines, so they surrendered to the Union Army. Now news of this victory reached New Orleans before the Yankees did. The local militia had fled, and leaving defense of the city up to the citizens. And those guys did several things just to annoy the hell out of the Yankees. For example, they dumped thousands of bales of cotton into the river and set fire to them and sent them floating down to the Yankees. They set fire to every ship that was in port at the time, and just to make sure that the Yankees did not enjoy their stay, they dumped every drop of liquor in New Orleans into the river. Nevertheless, now New Orleans was in Yankee hands, and that only left one obstacle to complete control of the Mississippi by the Union Navy, and that was the very formidable Confederate stronghold at Vicksburg, Mississippi. It would take a joint operation of both the Army and the Navy and another year before Vicksburg fell.
While the blockade runners were the dashing ships of the Confederacy, the other side of that coin were the much feared and hated commerce or sea raiders, and none more so than the Alabama. The sea raiders are credited or were responsible for destroying over 150 merchant ships, costing U.S. shippers millions of dollars, think billions in today's money. One of the epic sea battles between the Union and Confederate navies took place just off the shore of Schomberg, France in 1864. After 2 years of searching, the U.S. warship Kearsarge finally caught up with the Confederate raider Alabama and was now waiting just offshore. The two ships were evenly matched. The Kearsarge had bigger guns, but the Alabama was a newer ship with the latest weapons, considered faster, easier to load and aim, and could fire at a greater length. The Confederates believed that if they could keep the Kearsarge at arm's length, then they could win from a distance. The two captains knew one another. They had Captain Winslow here of the Kearsarge and Captain Semmes. They had been friends. They had served together in the U.S. Navy, and both were Southerners. America's Civil War had come to France. On the day of the battle, thousands were watching from the hillsides as the Alabama was escorted out of the harbor to neutral waters. Once the ships were 7 miles at sea, as planned, the Alabama fired first. 2 shells hit, most of them missed. The Kearsarge held its fire. The 2 ships began to circle. The Alabama got off 3 more broadsides. Most of them were high, most of them were wide, cut some rigging, most of them missed. The Kearsarge held its fire. And they began to circle and get closer and closer, and at a 1/4 mile distance, Captain Winslow gave his gunners the orders they were waiting for. Their 11-inch Dahlgren cannons fired big 136-pound balls. They were devastating. One of them exploded in the Alabama's coal bunkers. Others tore all the way through the ship, taking out its machinery. The Alabama continued to try to fire, but they were very ineffective. Finally, the Alabama was taking on water, starting to sink, and Captain Sims tried to get his ship to shore using sail, but a few more broadsides from the Kearsarge put an end to that. The Kearsarge gunners were very methodical and accurate. They didn't miss. After 1 hour after the first shells were fired, the much feared raider Alabama sank. Captain Sims had hoped to prove to the French critics that his raider could fight. But in truth, most of those who served aboard the Confederate raiders and privateers were soldier of fortune types. They were largely undisciplined. They were in it for the prize money, and they were really no match for a disciplined warship. Another raider was the Shenandoah. Now the Shenandoah made an around-the-world voyage, destroying Yankee shipping on the way. In the last months of the war, in 1865, it steamed all the way up into the Bering Sea, where it destroyed almost the entire U.S. whaling fleet. And communication being what it was back then, they continued to destroy Yankee shipping for another 4 months after the war was over. Upon learning for sure that Lee had surrendered and the war was over, Captain Waddell, the Confederate captain, he pulled off a rather amazing feat. He disguised the Shenandoah as a merchant ship. And then they steamed all the way from the North Pacific all the way back to Liverpool without stopping and without getting caught. Once they were in Liverpool, Captain Waddell turned his ship over to the British authorities, paid off his crew, and everybody just kind of melted away. Now earlier I told you that we had almost gone to war with the British twice during our Civil War. The first time was over the Trent Affair. And the second time was over the building of these raiders and ironclads. Shipyards over there had found ways to either ignore the neutrality laws or get around them. What they would do is build an ironclad for another country like Russia or Turkey, and then resell that back to the Confederacy. But Union spies were watching, and they knew what was going on. When U.S. Ambassador Adams heard of yet another ironclad being built for a foreign country, but for the Confederacy, he sent a letter to British Foreign Secretary Lord Russell, and part of it read, "One of the ironclads is about to leave. It would be superfluous in me to point out to your lordship, this means war." Well, again, Queen Victoria didn't want war, neither did President Lincoln. So to settle the matter once and for all, the British government purchased all warships being built for all countries and commissioned them into the Royal Navy.
The Anaconda Plan by this time was working very well. Vicksburg, Mississippi fell in 1863. This gave the Union Navy the complete control of the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf, and effectively cut off the Western Confederacy as a source of supplies and troops. Also in 1863, Charleston, South Carolina was closed. And by the summer of 1864, there were only 2 Confederate ports still open: Wilmington, North Carolina, and Mobile, Alabama. Well, in August of 1864, Admiral Farragut decided to close Mobile. And this was going to be a major project because the port was guarded by Fort Morgan on one side of the channel, Fort Gaines on the other side, and Fort Powell down here. 3 forts, plus a Confederate fleet. They had also strung a line of torpedo mines across the mouth of the port. leaving a gap of about 200 yards next to Fort Morgan for access by blockade runners. Well, Farragut's plan was to run this gap with wooden ships lashed to the starboard side of his fleet to absorb fire from Fort Morgan. Once the fleet was through, they would cut loose their wooden ships and engage the Confederate fleet. Well, when this operation began, the leading Union ship, the Tecumseh, struck a mine, exploded, and sank. And all of the rest of the ships behind it stopped, all the while taking fire from Fort Morgan. Well, this awkward moment gave rise to a bit of Navy lore, because Admiral Farragut is reputed to have shouted, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead!" Well, whatever he said, got them through. They cut loose the wooden ships and engaged the Confederate fleet. Now, the flagship of the Confederate fleet was the very formidable Tennessee. It was a huge ironclad, well fortified, and it took a combined operation of several Union ships to get the Tennessee to surrender. But once she struck her colors, all the rest of the Confederate fleet surrendered also. Now, Fort Powell, the Confederates evacuated Fort Powell the same day. Fort Gaines fell to Union troops the next day, but Fort Morgan was heavily fortified. It took 2 weeks of shelling that fort before it surrendered. That left Wilmington, North Carolina. Wilmington, North Carolina. Yes, I need the next slide. And that left Wilmington, North Carolina as the last remaining open Confederate port. It was guarded by Fort Fisher at the mouth of the Cape Fear River. And the Federals decided to take this fort with a joint operation of the Union Navy and the Union Army. And once the ships and the troops were in place, the battle was easily won. So with all Confederate ports closed, it appeared that the end of the Confederacy was in sight.
Indeed it was. By the close of 1864, General Sherman's troops were on the march across Georgia. By now, all the Confederate ports were in Union hands, and all of their ironclads and other vessels were either sunk or captured. These were desperate times. The price of food was astronomical, and the Confederate currency was worthless. Go back one. Southern women whose husbands had been killed or were in prison camps were forming caravans to sneak cotton or anything they could sell across the lines to northern agents who were now paying top dollar. Early in the war, the Confederates had tried to open a corridor to California so they could capture the gold fields. And because the Union was blockading their fleets, the Confederates also considered using San Diego and San Pedro as their open ports to Europe. Skirmishes between Union and Confederate forces were fought. They fought skirmishes in what was now Arizona. The Union had a squadron of just 4 ships out here on the west coast. Its job was to patrol up and down the coast and protect the shipments of silver and gold from the mines. The bullion would travel from San Francisco on down to Panama. and then it was offloaded and carried across the 60 miles of the isthmus and then reloaded and taken on to New York. General Grant said, "I do not know what we would do in this national crisis were it not for the gold from California." Many Southerners had settled here in California, especially here in the lower half of the state. So from about San Luis Obispo south, a large percentage of the population had Southern sympathies. The northern part of the state was decidedly pro-Union. And to complicate matters, there was a large Californio population out here. They didn't care who won the war. In fact, they were still upset that California was no longer part of Mexico. So they had more loyalty to the Mexican government than they had to either the North or the South. And agitators, Southern agitators were out here trying to take advantage of that. They were stirring that pot of dissent. So the threat of a Confederate takeover from within the state was very real. Newspaper articles, historical documents, military orders and letters clearly document the unrest that took place out here during the Civil War. In one case, Confederates armed a schooner, much like these, and recruited Southern sympathizers up in San Francisco. They planned to capture steamers carrying gold. And they even had letters of the mark from Jefferson Davis. They were found out, they were arrested. There was a case where Confederates boarded a steamer down in Panama. And they had planned to take control of the ship once they were at sea. And they were going to steam it into a southern port, arm it, and turn it into a privateer up and down the Confederate privateer up and down the West Coast. They were discovered and they were found out and arrested also. There was even a captain of a U.S. Revenue Service vessel planned to capture his own ship. And this took place while they were over in Victoria, Canada. The first officer, knowing of his captain's Confederate leanings, waited until the captain and some of his supporters went ashore, and then with a loyal crew of only 6 men, they threw off the mooring lines and they steamed back across the straits to Port Townsend on the other side. So although we didn't have the battles, the sea battles and the land battles out here as they had back east, nonetheless, a lot has been written. And those living here at the time had every reason to be concerned. Now, we've put up a slide to give a plug to our friends down at the Drum Barrack Civil War Museum in Wilmington. Jerry and I visited down there a while back. And when the director learned of our talk, she just opened the place up to her. She gave us access to their extensive Civil War library. They do a great job of documenting what took place out here during our Civil War.
Now you've heard our presentation, and if we have piqued your curiosity about any of the information that we've presented, then that was our goal. So thank you for being here tonight.